Hello, friendly alumni. You're listening to From Here Forward, an award-winning UBC podcast. I'm Carol.
And I'm Jeevan. Quick question for you, Carol. Are you an outdoorsy kind of gal?
Not really. Why are you?
I mean, I'll dabble here and there. I feel like I don't really do my BC identity justice by not taking advantage of the beautiful outdoors. But I'm just curious, it's something we haven't talked about before.
Why would you think I would be more outdoorsy than you?
Because you have like an athletic vibe.
Yeah, in the confines of a gym. I never hiked once when I lived in Vancouver.
Well, this might be something that we actually agree on. What's your comfort level like with animals, particularly ones out in the wild?
See, this might get me canceled because I do not like them. I don't like nature. I'm allergic to nature. I don't see the hype around seeing a little cub. What about you, Jeevan?
I think I like it in a controlled environment. And I think mainly it's because I have no survival instincts at all,
I agree. When people are like, if you see a certain type of bear, you should do XYZ. My instinct is just take me. I'm here in a situation where you, the bear, are in front of me. I deserve it.
I'm right there with you.
Well, this is a great segue into our guest for this month's episode because he would absolutely beg to differ on our hot takes around wild animals in nature.
Carol and I sat down with Mateen Hessami, a Master's of Science graduate and wildlife biologist currently working in Kelowna out of UBC Okanagan.
Mateen has worked alongside several First Nations and Indigenous communities and with the federal and provincial government to operationalize wildlife management and recovery for caribou and moose.
He's incredibly passionate about reciprocal community-based wildlife ecology, working alongside communities to build trust and care, and the importance of responsible wild hunting and conservation work.
Jeevan and I certainly learned a lot, and we hope you do too. So let's get into it.
I'm calling in from UBC Okanagan campus here in beautiful Kelowna, and I am a wildlife biologist. I support mostly First Nation communities as well as provincial and federal governments in operationalizing wildlife management, monitoring, recovery, mostly for caribou and moose in British Columbia.
And can you tell us a bit about when you first became interested in wildlife biology? What first sparked this interest and made you consider this as a potential career?
I was always into animals, going on road trips, seeing coyotes and elk, and I was always so fascinated by them. But I really became captivated with the wildlife biology world when I moved to the US when I was 11. On my mom's side of the family, they hunt quite a bit in Idaho. So we moved to Spokane, Washington, and I would hunt with my uncle in Idaho, and he really instilled a passion for the outdoors, for fishing, camping, hunting. And I remember we were driving these back roads. My uncle had drawn a moose tag, and we ran into this biologist who had one of those antennas, and he was just pulled over the side of the road. And I told my uncle to stop, and we talked to this guy, and he was looking for wolves in the North Idaho backcountry. And so talking to him and just realizing that one could have a career chasing beautiful mammals in the mountains.
I understand that when you joined UBC, you created a conservation wild food student group. Is that correct?
Yeah. The group's called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. It's a nonprofit that's really about advocacy of wild places, conservation, and the importance of hunting and conservation. And so I was a part of a university club at the University of Montana. And then when I started my master's, there wasn't anything like that here. So myself and some of my peers decided to start our own program here at UBC Okanagan. And we bring students out, teach them how to hunt and fish. We have a gear library. So if a student wants to go ice fishing, they've got this awesome array of ice fishing gear. If they want to go duck hunting, we've got duck decoys. We also have tents. And we try and make a trip to the Lower Mainland or Southern BC every year and teach students how to waterfowl hunt, the importance of hunting and conservation, but also the immense benefits of harvesting wild food and how delicious it is. So we'll cook up wild duck, and it's a really awesome program, and it's still going strong here at UBC.
Can you tell me a bit, for someone who's not familiar with what a community-based wildlife ecologist does, what does the day-to-day of that kind of work look like?
I like to compare myself to maybe a wedding planner, but in the conservation world, in the sense that, wedding planners are running around coordinating multiple things all to make the one thing, getting married, work and make sure it goes smoothly. And so day to day, meeting with multiple stakeholders and rights holders. So people with the provincial government, the federal government, nonprofit partners who provide funding, hustling funds. So there's a lot of time behind the computer, but every about 2 months or so, I'm lucky to go up north into these communities and spend a week or so with them doing awesome things. So for example, just a month ago, I was up around Smithers, BC, just a little bit east with Lake Babine Nation. And we collared 25 moose. So we put these necklaces on moose that we can track where they go. We got to jump out of the helicopter and tackle moose. And it was really cool, really rewarding. Good to be on the land.
Can you explain what is the importance of hunting and conservation and why is that so important to you?
I think a lot of us think, hunting an animal, that must have a negative effect in the sense that you're killing this individual animal and we must be like bestowing harm. But in North America, there's really highly regulated systems of hunting in the sense that typically it's mature adult males that are harvested. And there is just a lot of good science that shows unequivocally that the harvest done by humans can be like 1% to 3% of the population. And it's usually done, on male, for example, male deer or male moose, and one male moose could breed, 30 or 40 females throughout the year. But to really get to the heart of your question, hunters are advocates and champions of the land. They want to see their children, the next generation, to experience what they experience. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions with hunters that it's the kill that is what is so important. And that's such a small part of hunting. If you ask most hunters, they'll actually say harvesting that animal, killing that animal is their least favorite part. That's just a small percentage. The other 95% is learning about the land, going out. And there's this incentive from hunters to keep these lands wild and keep the disturbance low and also keep the population strong enough so that hunters can go back year after year. So hunters are one of the leading stakeholder groups that say, in northern British Columbia, we want caribou populations to be healthy. And because they're at the town hall meetings and they're some of the strongest advocates in the room, what that means is that when the time comes, for a potential development or some other landscape change, that hunters are at the forefront of saying, hold on a second, we want to ensure this population of caribou do well. And there's peripheral benefits to even the average citizen, like ensuring that caribou populations are strong in northern British Columbia means that we're protecting some of the most wild and intact ecosystems in North America. It translates to clean and cold water that we can enjoy, clean air. We all appreciate nature. The last example I'll give why hunting is conservation is hunters are unique in the sense that they contribute data to those populations. For example, if you hunt moose in the province of British Columbia, you're required to tell the province every year what you saw out there. And if you have, hundreds or thousands of these people, and throughout time, you can develop these long-term data sets where you can see how hunters were successful over time. So especially in these remote, vast landscapes of northern Canada, we need all the help we can get and all the data we can get. Hunting is a very sustainable practice. It's so much better and from a carbon footprint point of view and an animal ethical point of view for you to harvest a wild animal that's lived a wild, happy life, peacefully died within a few seconds of you shooting that animal versus animals that are in slaughterhouses and live shoulder to shoulder.
So for people who have very limited knowledge about moose and caribou, what are they like in the wild? I'm a city girl. I've never seen an animal besides the odd raccoon.
Moose are one of the biggest members of the deer family, and caribou are also part of the deer family. Caribou are a super interesting critter in that they're one of the last animals to have survived the Ice Age that lives in North America. And they're this very cold Ice Age adapted critter in the sense that they really thrive in ecosystems that are cold, snowy, and are far away from people and human influence. And caribou are a very sensitive animal, and you may have seen over the years that they're in trouble. They're in trouble across Canada, and they're in trouble because they are this relic of the Ice Age, and they haven't evolved and adapted as well as moose, elk, and deer, in the sense that they're not very good at sensing danger and running away from animals. Their defense strategy that they evolved with was to live and occupy habitats in which there was not a lot of predators. So, in other words, they need ecosystems that are very intact and that there's not a lot of other critters running around to compete with them. And the reason that caribou are declining is that we have rapidly changed the ecosystem in which they live in the sense that we've created logging, like cut blocks, those big openings in the mountains. And when we do that, we expose a forest floor that traditionally the sunlight would not hit. It was a very shaded forest floor. And when the sunlight is able to hit that floor and we disturb it, plants grow. So leafy, yummy plants grow, and that draws in more moose and more deer. And in consequence, where all of a sudden caribou used to be the only dominant large mammal, and now you've got moose and deer, more wolves, more mountain lions, and in consequence, they predate on caribou at unsustainable rates. So the fancy scientific term for that is apparent competition, where the moose and deer aren't necessarily competing for the same food sources, but what happens is they facilitate more predators coming into the system. That's one of the two ultimate causes of caribou decline. The second cause of caribou decline is climate change. So our world is becoming warmer, and because of that, there's more fires. The winter severity is less. So again, that helps those ungulates, that's what we call the hooved animals, that helps moose and deer do better on a yearly basis because fire creates more leafy, yummy food and opens up the forest canopy. And it allows deer to move further northward. And when these deer are in the boreal forest, there's more predators, more wolves than what the caribou evolved for thousands of years to sustain. Because caribou can't like kick and fight like moose and deer and elk. You maybe see those videos of the mama moose getting mad and like charging a person. That is a evolutionary strategy to fight their way away from wolves. And you see deer running fast and elk running fast. And caribou can also run fast, but throughout the thousands of years of their evolution, they just never had a reason to really like be super wary of wolves. Because again, they existed in these landscapes that there was very few wolves. So it was not really a problem. There's the landscape change and the climate change. Landscape change, not only have we changed the structure of the forest to be more beneficial for moose, deer, and elk, we've also created all these roads. And those roads, often referred to as linear features, it creates a highway for wolves because wolves are a coursing predator. So their strategy is to cover as much ground as possible and try and encounter as much prey. So with these roads, wolves are able to move further and faster and encounter more caribou. So it's kind of a double whammy on the landscape change front in that there's more moose and deer because the forest structure has changed and there's more roads. So the caribou are just kind of caught in the middle of this and they've declined significantly. It's interesting, like moose are newcomers to here in Kelowna. There was not moose here traditionally. In fact, the Okanagan Nation, they don't have an Indigenous name or word for moose because they're newcomers in the sense that moose have proliferated, rapidly across British Columbia. And it was really only started in the 1900s. And so there's this inverse thing that's happened, more moose and less caribou. But moose are pretty awesome because they're tasty. They reproduce quite quickly. They're beautiful. They're still an iconic and culturally important animal for lots of people. But like to summarize it at a high level, moose are doing okay in British Columbia, whereas caribou are struggling.
So, I mean, what you're saying, there's a lot of interesting things that you've seen. I'm just curious, have there been any highlights so far in your career at this point that you think you'll cherish for however long you continue to do this work?
If I was to look back in the last 12 months, working with Lake Babine Nation is definitely a highlight and like a deep honor of my career. They're a really incredible First Nations group in North Central BC, and they're leading a precedent-setting effort to recover moose to their traditional territory. It's a very important food source. And I think just spending time with the guardians, so there's these 4 guardians, they're like kind of rangers. They're the eyes and ears of the nation. They're basically the ones that do the monitoring. And, just going out with them, I think to a moment this September, we were actually boating around the territory looking for moose. And there was a record-setting salmon run this year. And I was standing over a bridge and there was literally so many salmon that you couldn't see the water. It was just red. So being able to see those glimpses of abundance and that there are still in special places in our world that are doing well relatively, but most importantly, that there's a strong community connection, a group of local people that really want to do best and do well for their lands. Another highlight, I work for McLeod Lake Indian Band, and in mid-December, we flew a caribou survey. We discovered this caribou herd that had been extirpated since 2014. So we basically discovered that there's 7 individuals. So that was an amazing moment to fly over the tippy top of a mountain. It was like minus 50 with the wind chill because we landed the machine and we collected some of the caribou poop. But the highlight there was that we found this caribou herd that, government officials have said has gone extinct, and our finding says the opposite. So definitely being out on the land is a highlight.
I'm curious about how the process has been for you, one, spending time with various nations and learning about their ways of living, and why it's so important within the ecology space to be centering the voices of Indigenous peoples and how they navigate these dynamics that you're sharing with us today.
There's often this misconception that humans are separated from nature, and it's almost this romantic ideology that nature can only be best in this kind of pristine glass box where people aren't part of the equation. And that is just unequivocally untrue in the sense that we have such remarkable evidence, archaeological evidence, and I'll highlight some from British Columbia, like in the coastal regions of BC and in Washington, there has been archaeological evidence showing that First Peoples were managing sea otters, like killing sea otters, hundreds, thousands of years ago, because they were competing with their ability to obtain shellfish and salmon. In Banff National Park, the Stoney Nakoda, there's remarkable evidence that there was rotational burns. So they were burning the landscape. They were in essence farming the landscape because they recognized that by burning, you could grow more, sheep and bison, just the process I just described with moose and deer. And in northern British Columbia, the late Bob Hayes, he recently passed away, but he made a really cool discovery in a wolf den in northern BC. And it was the discovery of this old arrowhead that was carbon dated to be about 800 years old. So that shows that the Casca and Tahltan people were crawling into these wolf dens, presumably managing these wolves because they understood that there was a competition between wolves, caribou, moose. So I just wanted to start with that background and say that that's really how I approach and center my work with these communities, is that humans are so interconnected and integral to these systems. And I think approaching those communities that you understand their way of life, their rural way of life, the importance of wild food, of, not purchasing a steak that's $45 and you don't know where it came from, the ability, the constitutional right to harvest wild food and provide for your community, how important that is. Working with these communities, there's a saying, you work at the speed of trust, and I really prioritize listening and learning. And at the end of the day, I'm working on behalf of them and I'm trying to help them solve problems. Those problems mostly being growing more wildlife that they harvest and consume. And I also really like to take time to learn beyond the hunting and the land stuff. For example, every time I go to Lake Babine to work, I stay with a family. One of the guardians, his name's Willie Bertacco. I stay with his family and I'll go to hockey practice with their kid and go to the park. And it's just beyond working. It's, to me, this world of reconciliation and working with communities. It takes a lot of time and you really have to show that you're a meaningful partner. And I guess lucky for me, like, I don't have to fake any of that because I'm just so interested in what these folks do. And
the trust and the rapport building, I imagine it can be difficult, or there might be challenges with that kind of relationship building as a scientist entering these spaces. Or I guess, is that true? Are there these challenges that you've had to overcome as you were starting to kind of work in this space?
For sure. There's lots of challenges and, past traumas and past and current exploitation that occurs specifically in like the science world. The classic thing is you'll have a group from a university or, from a city center that goes up, 15 hours north and says, I want to help you. I want to work for you. But the underlying, sometimes nefarious reason that they're doing that is to benefit their own career. And like, that's something I'm so proud of working here at UBCO. Dr. Adam Ford was my advisor, and his approach and his wildlife research lab is pretty well what I described in terms of my approach to working with communities. It's very community forward, bottom up. It's very genuine. To answer that, yes, there are unfortunately a lot of groups that will try and infiltrate and influence these northern communities, especially First Nation communities, to advance their own agenda or mission or set of values. You've got a bunch of folks from urban centers that to make a difference up north, and it can often be misplaced if you don't take the time to learn that these folks that were, trapping seals and trapping coyotes, they are actually some of the best stewards and champions of the land. It's really important to just know the intricacies of the economies, the connections with nature. And again, I'm really proud that our group here at UBC Okanagan and beyond really takes the time to understand that we're guests in the territory and we want the relationships to be meaningful, win-win scenarios in the sense that we want to advance the goals that they need help with.
It's so interesting hearing about your approach to this work because it feels so holistic, which is really cool. It's taking the sociopolitical context as well as the science and the ecological perspective and building them all together into a practice, which is super interesting. In reflecting on that and reflecting on your journey thus far, what impact do you hope that your work will have in this space moving forward?
I think the impact that I hope to achieve is twofold, but interconnected. The first one being the impact on local communities, just being able to captivate young people into being interested in learning about nature in their backyards and equipping some of these community members with the tools and the education to hopefully do what I do instead of relying on a contractor. The ultimate dream is that these communities have their own wildlife biologists that have the education and the ability to oversee their program. So that's a huge priority for me, is just rekindling traditional connections to the land that Indigenous peoples have and having a role in rekindling those connections. And I think science and wildlife management are great vehicles and vectors for that rekindling of nature between Indigenous rural people and the wildlands of Canada. And then the second goal that I want to go to sleep at night thinking I've contributed to is enacting meaningful and measurable change on the land. So it's kind of a dream of every biologist to be a part of efforts that actually translate to outcomes that animals notice, that it's not just planning meetings and presentations and reports, but you're a part of an effort to measurably change how things look on the land. And on the wildlife front, like being able to grow more moose, like measurably year after year. We get up in the helicopter, we count that there's more moose in 2028 than we counted in 2025. Like, that would be a huge accomplishment.
Are there any things that you wanted to mention about your work, questions you want our listeners to consider?
I think the whole world is feeling a shift in economic standing across sectors, including the universities. We're seeing a tightening of budgets, and we will continue to see that. And I think wildlife, unfortunately, are often the first to be neglected. I would just urge the listeners of this podcast and society as a whole to really recognize that investing in nature and conservation and biodiversity is really at the best interest of all of us. And it goes beyond monitoring the land, growing animals for the land. It's about, preserving the ecological integrity that we rely on for clean drinking water, clean air, as well as our ability to connect with nature in a good way. So I would just impart that if there's any chance to communicate to your local political folks, just the importance of nature, conservation, biodiversity, centering local peoples, I think that's really, really important. And just one more sub point there is just the importance of local and Indigenous peoples being at the front of these efforts, even if it's the development of a mine or industry. You guys may have seen in the news, Tahltan central government, they're a nation in northern BC. They just signed a really sweeping agreement on mineral extraction. And I think that is the future, that co-partnership with nations, but really ensuring that if and when these projects go forward, that the local land users are the ones that are at the forefront of it. Because for so much of history, the definition of colonialism, it hasn't always gone that way.
Awesome. Since we are at the end of it, and I want you to really think about this question as a scientist, as a human being.
Okay.
What are you? More like a caribou or a moose?
I would say I'm more like a caribou because caribou really like wild places and they're just so majestic. I think caribou, yeah, I love caribou. Every year I've been going up north. I spend 2 weeks up north. I'll fly in a float plane to a little lake. They drop me off, and for 2 weeks, and the last few years I've done it completely solo, and it's a life-altering experience to be up there hunting caribou. Most of these trips I don't see not only a human, but I don't even see a boot print of a human. And there's psychological transformation that happens. And this has been studied. When you spend more than 3 days away from your phone, away from the world, you feel so present and this just another level of harmony. And for me, being up there, that's where the caribou are still doing well. There's still pockets of BC where caribou are doing well. It's directly related to where there's not a lot of disturbance. And that's just the pinnacle. That's heaven for me, is being in those wild places where you don't see another person. And so that's why I would say I'm more like a caribou, but I love moose as well. So it is a tough one.
Lovely. That was a very important question for us to end off on. So thank you so much for your time. It's been lovely chatting with you.
So, Carol, any changes of heart about the natural world after our chat with Mateen?
I do appreciate his enthusiasm and love for the wild outdoors, especially when he talked about going out for 3 days, no cell service, just him, his thoughts, and the world. That was really cool. But as he was describing this experience, I was like, again, I would just go, take me. This is the end for me. I'm sure it brings peace to some people, but the thought of me in the outdoors with no cell service, as a woman especially, I don't like it. What about you?
I'm just sitting with that visual that you provided, and it's disturbing me as well. I think that I learned a lot from that conversation, and I feel like as much as I'm not one of the people who's going to be out there doing the work, it's really nice knowing that there's all kinds of work going on. One thing I really liked that Mateen mentioned was this kind of fallacy of nature being separate from humans, and this idea that there's the social world of human beings and then there's physical nature, but in reality those things are actually completely interconnected. Thinking about that as we move through our day-to-day life felt really cool, particularly the things that he mentioned around relationship building with Indigenous folks and centering their teachings.
I recognize that I sound like a very anti-nature person, and I just want to clarify, I too really support the people who are doing this work. As much as you could not pay me to do it, I'm so glad that there are people who are not like me, who value the outdoors and wildlife management, find peace in being one with nature.
I think that's good self-awareness.
Thank you. And with that, thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling your feels, please drop us a review. You can find me on Blue Sky at Carol Eugene Park.
And me on Twitter at Jeevan K. Sangha.
From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Kylie McFedrin for Podium Podcast Company.